moments become the most liberating ones. This is the true story of a millionaire tech CEO who thought money could buy silence, a pregnant woman who discovered courage she never knew she had, and one viral moment that changed everything. When Rebecca suggested postponing their vacation home purchase, she had no idea those words would trigger a chain of events that would destroy a $50 million empire, land her husband in prison, and set her free from 4 years of hidden abuse. By tomorrow morning, this incident would have 2 million views, SWAT teams would surround their mansion, and Rebecca would face the most important choice of her life: accept $5 million to stay silent or risk everything to speak her truth. What would you do if your safety had a price tag? What would you choose if courage cost you everything you thought you wanted? This is Rebecca Morrison's story of choosing truth over comfort, voice over silence, and discovering that some things really are worth more than all the money in the world. Stay with me for the next 90 minutes because this story will change how you think about love, money, and what it really means to be free. The chair missed her head by inches. Rebecca Morrison stood frozen in their marble kitchen, 7 months pregnant, watching the antique dining chair crash through the floor-to-ceiling window behind her. Glass exploded inward like a waterfall of diamonds, each shard catching the overhead lights as it rained down on their imported Italian tiles. The sound was deafening, a crash that seemed to echo through every room of their 4,000-square-foot mansion. Her hand flew instinctively to her belly, protecting the baby inside as her millionaire ex-husband Garrett paced like a caged animal in front of her. His perfectly pressed shirt was soaked with sweat, his usually immaculate hair disheveled from running his hands through it over and over again. The man who commanded boardrooms with quiet confidence had devolved into something primal and dangerous. $2 million, Rebecca, Garrett screamed, his voice raw with rage. $2 million fucking dollars down the drain because those investors don't understand vision. They don't see the bigger picture. She had only suggested they postpone buying the vacation home in Aspen. A reasonable suggestion, she thought, given that his latest tech startup had just lost a massive funding round that morning. The call had come in during breakfast, and she had watched Garrett's face transform from confident optimism to barely contained fury as his lead investor explained why they were pulling out. But reasonable had left their marriage months ago, gradually replaced by Garrett's explosive reactions to anything that challenged his control or questioned his judgment. "I just thought maybe we should wait," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of glass still settling on the floor. "Until things stabilize with the company, until we know where we stand financially." "Wait?" He spun toward her, his eyes wild with a mixture of panic and rage she had never seen before. "You think I built a $50 million company by waiting? You think your comfortable life, this house, your car, your clothes, everything you touch, comes from being cautious?" Rebecca felt the baby kick, as if sensing the tension radiating through every cell of her body. She had learned to read Garrett's moods over their 4 years of marriage like a meteorologist tracking storm patterns. But tonight felt different, more dangerous. The financial pressure from his failing app launch, combined with the stress of their upcoming IPO and the constant scrutiny from investors, had pushed him past his usual limits of emotional abuse into something much darker. The kitchen around them bore witness to their wealth: custom cabinets that cost more than most people's cars, countertops carved from single slabs of Carrara marble, appliances that looked like they belonged in a high-end restaurant. But all that luxury felt meaningless now, surrounded by the destruction of Garrett's lost control. "I'm not attacking you, Garrett," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm just trying to be practical. We have a baby coming. Maybe we should focus on that instead of adding more debt." "Don't you dare lecture me about responsibility." He grabbed another chair from their dining set, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might throw it too. His knuckles went white as he gripped the mahogany frame. "I carry this entire household financially. I pay for your clothes, your car, this house, your food, your medical bills, everything. Every single thing you touch in your life comes from my work, my success, my sacrifices. And you have the audacity to question my decisions?" The irony wasn't lost on her, even in her fear. She had been a successful marketing executive when they met at a tech conference 5 years ago. She was pulling in 6 figures annually, managing major accounts for Fortune 500 companies, building a reputation in her industry. But Garrett had systematically convinced her to quit her job, to let him take care of everything. He needed her support, he said. His company required total focus, and he couldn't give it his all while worrying about her career stress. She could always go back to work later, once his company was established. They would have more money than they knew what to do with. She wouldn't need to work unless she wanted to. Later never came. Instead, she found herself increasingly isolated from her professional network, financially dependent on a man whose definition of support involved controlling every aspect of her life. Her friends stopped calling after she canceled plans one too many times because Garrett needed her at home. Her former colleagues moved on without her, filling her absence with other talented people who were actually available to do the work. "I carried our first baby alone while you traveled for business," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. 3 months of bed rest, doctor visits, sleepless nights with morning sickness. "I think I understand responsibility." That's when he exploded. Garrett's face contorted with fury as he grabbed the heavy oak dining chair, one of 8 that had cost them $15,000 for the set. For a split second that felt like an eternity, Rebecca saw her death in his eyes. The chair flew toward her head with terrifying force, propelled by years of accumulated rage and the desperate panic of a man watching his empire crumble. She ducked instinctively, muscle memory from childhood playground, dangers taking over her conscious mind. The whoosh of air as the chair missed her by mere inches stirred her hair. She felt the weight of it, the solid reality of 20 pounds of carved wood that could have killed her and her unborn child. The crash was deafening. Glass scattered everywhere as the window shattered completely, leaving a gaping hole that let in the cold November air. The chair bounced once on the patio outside before coming to rest in her carefully maintained flower garden, crushing the last of the autumn mums she had planted just weeks earlier. Rebecca's ears rang from the impact, and she realized she was shaking uncontrollably. Blood dripped from a small cut on her forearm where flying glass had nicked her. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as adrenaline flooded her system. "Oh God," Garrett whispered, suddenly seeming to realize the magnitude of what he had done. "Rebecca, I wasn't aiming for you. I was aiming for the wall. I would never hurt you." But she wasn't looking at him anymore. Through the destroyed window, she could see their neighbor Maggie Henderson standing in her own kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring directly at them with an expression of horror and recognition. Their eyes met across the gap between houses, and Rebecca saw something she hadn't seen in years. Witness. Someone had seen what Garrett really was behind the closed doors of their perfect life. Someone had witnessed the explosion of violence that she had been navigating alone for so long, tiptoeing around and managing and absorbing until she had almost forgotten what normal relationships looked like. "Maggie's calling someone," Rebecca said quietly, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Garrett rushed to the window, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching on broken glass with each step. "Shit, shit, shit, shit." He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it standing at odd angles. "We need to clean this up. We need to figure out how to explain this was an accident." But Rebecca could already hear sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. The sound seemed to cut through the night air like a promise of rescue she hadn't dared to hope for. As she stood in their destroyed kitchen, blood on her arm and glass scattered through her hair, she realized something had fundamentally changed in the space between the chair leaving Garrett's hands and crashing through their window. The chair missing her head wasn't luck. It wasn't divine intervention. It wasn't Garrett's good aim or lack thereof. It was a wake-up call that had been 4 years in the making. The sirens grew closer, and Garrett's panic intensified with each passing second. "Tell them it was an accident," he demanded, grabbing her shoulders with hands that trembled. "Tell them we were moving furniture around, getting ready for the baby, and the chair slipped from my hands. Tell them anything except the truth." Rebecca looked down at his hands on her shoulders, hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts, hands that had caressed her face during their early courtship, hands that had just thrown a chair at her head while she was pregnant with his child. Then she looked at the destruction around them, the evidence of what their marriage had really become. Finally, she looked at Maggie Henderson, who was still watching from her window, with the phone pressed to her ear. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't immediately agree to protect Garrett from the consequences of his actions. "Let go of me," she said quietly. "Rebecca, please." His grip tightened. "My IPO is next month. Next month. If this gets out, if there's any hint of domestic issues, it will destroy everything I've built. The investors will run. The board will panic. Everything we've worked for will disappear." She looked down at her pregnant belly, then back at his desperate face. "What exactly have we worked for, Garrett? Because I'm starting to think I don't know anymore." The sirens were almost at their street now, and neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the sound of shattering glass and raised voices that had carried across their quiet suburban neighborhood. Their private hell was about to become very public, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain yet, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just the hope that came with her pregnancy, the biological imperative of new life growing inside her, but the hope that maybe, finally, someone would see what was really happening behind the facade of their successful marriage. That maybe the isolation Garrett had built around her was about to crack open like the window, letting in light and air and the possibility of escape. The red and blue lights were visible now, painting their neighbors' houses in alternating colors as the police cars turned onto their street. Garrett released her shoulders and began pacing frantically between the kitchen island and the destroyed window. "This is a disaster," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "The press will have a field day. Tech CEO arrested for domestic violence. My competitors will use this to destroy me. The venture capital firms will blacklist me. I'll never get funding again." Even now, facing the collapse of everything he had built, Garrett's primary concern was his business reputation, not her safety, not their unborn child, not the fact that he had just attempted to kill his pregnant wife in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The narcissistic abuse that had defined their relationship was so deeply ingrained that he couldn't see past his own needs even in this moment of crisis. Rebecca pressed the dish towel harder against the cut on her arm, watching the white fabric turn red with her blood. The sight was strangely clarifying. This was real. The blood was real. The violence was real. The danger she had been in was real. All the years of gaslighting and manipulation couldn't change the physical evidence of what had just happened. "They're stopping in front of our house," she said, watching through the broken window as 3 police cars pulled up to their circular driveway. Garrett's face went white. "Remember what I said? This was an accident. We were rearranging furniture and the chair slipped. That's all they need to know." But as Rebecca watched the officers emerge from their vehicles, adjusting their equipment and surveying the scene with professional efficiency, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like someone was coming to help her. Not to judge her, not to manage her, not to control her, but simply to help. The feeling was so foreign after 4 years of isolation that it took her breath away. "Ma'am, we're sending units immediately." Maggie Henderson gripped her phone tighter as she described what she had just witnessed to the 911 dispatcher. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the device steady. She had been washing dishes at her kitchen sink when she heard the shouting next door. Nothing unusual for the Morrison household, unfortunately. But the sound of shattering glass and seeing furniture fly through the air changed everything. "I saw him throw a chair at his pregnant wife," Maggie said, her voice trembling with adrenaline and outrage. "She's about 7 months along, and there's glass everywhere. I can see blood on her arm from here." The dispatcher's voice remained calm and professional, a steady anchor in the chaos. "Are there weapons in the house that you know of?" Maggie looked through her kitchen window toward Garrett's home office, clearly visible through his large windows. The gun cabinet was unmistakable. A tall, lighted display case with at least 6 hunting rifles arranged behind tempered glass doors. She had always wondered why a tech entrepreneur needed such an extensive collection of firearms, especially living in one of the safest neighborhoods in the city. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He collects hunting rifles. I can see them from here in what looks like his office. There's a whole cabinet full of them. We're dispatching multiple units now. Please stay inside and away from windows. Do not attempt to intervene. We'll have officers on scene within minutes." But Maggie couldn't look away from the drama unfolding next door. She had watched the Morrisons for 2 years since they moved into the neighborhood, had seen their arguments escalate gradually from raised voices to the kind of shouting matches that made other neighbors close their windows and turn up their televisions. She had noticed the pattern. Garrett's voice getting louder and more aggressive. Rebecca's voice getting quieter and more placating. The way Rebecca flinched when he moved too quickly during their backyard barbecues. The expensive gifts that appeared after particularly bad fights. The new car in the driveway. The jewelry Rebecca wore to neighborhood gatherings. The flowers delivered by the truckload as if diamonds and roses could erase emotional bruises. As a retired social worker who had spent 30 years working with families in crisis, Maggie recognized the classic patterns of domestic violence. She had been waiting for something like this to happen, dreading it but expecting it. Men like Garrett Morrison, successful, charming, controlling, didn't suddenly develop self-control. They escalated until something external forced them to stop. She had watched Rebecca transform over the 2 years they had lived next door. The confident, professional woman who had introduced herself when they first moved in had gradually become withdrawn and anxious. Rebecca stopped hosting the dinner parties she had mentioned planning. She stopped gardening, an activity she had told Maggie she loved. She stopped taking the long walks around the neighborhood that had been part of her daily routine. Most telling of all, Rebecca had stopped working. Maggie remembered the excitement in her voice when she talked about her marketing career during those early conversations over the fence. But within 6 months of moving in, Rebecca was home all day, every day, while Garrett left each morning in his Tesla and returned each evening with the kind of tension that seemed to fill their entire house. Inside the Morrison house, chaos reigned with the particular intensity that comes from years of dysfunction, finally exploding into violence. Rebecca sat on one of the kitchen stools that hadn't been destroyed, picking shards of glass out of her hair, while Garrett alternated between apologizing profusely and blaming her for pushing him to his breaking point. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry," he said, his voice cycling through different emotional registers like a broken radio scanning stations. "You know I would never intentionally hurt you. You know I love you more than anything." Then without pause, he would shift into justification mode. "But you know how stressed I am right now. The company is hanging by a thread. We're 3 weeks away from the biggest IPO in tech this year, and everything is falling apart. When you question my judgment about money, when you make me feel like you don't trust me to provide for our family, it just pushes me over the edge." Rebecca pressed a clean section of the dish towel against the cut on her arm, watching her blood seep through the white fabric. The wound was deeper than she had initially thought, requiring steady pressure to slow the bleeding. "You threw a chair at my head, Garrett, while I'm 7 months pregnant with your child. I threw it at the wall. I was aiming for the wall behind you, and my control was off because I was so upset. You know I would never hurt you intentionally. You know I'm not that kind of man." She looked at him with new clarity, as if the shattering glass had somehow cleared her vision as well. How many times had she heard variations of this speech? After he punched a hole in their bedroom wall during an argument about her spending time with her sister. After he shattered her favorite vase, a wedding gift from her grandmother, because dinner wasn't ready when he came home from a bad day at the office. After he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises and then claimed he was just trying to get her attention because she wasn't listening to him. Each time she had accepted his explanations. Each time she had absorbed his anger and made excuses for his behavior. Each time she had convinced herself that his stress levels would improve, that his success would make him happier, that their love would be enough to heal whatever was broken inside him. "The sirens are getting closer," she said, hearing the wail of multiple emergency vehicles approaching their neighborhood. Garrett's panic intensified as red and blue lights began flashing through what remained of their kitchen window, casting eerie shadows across the glass-covered floor. "We can fix this," he said frantically, his voice taking on the desperate edge of a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems with money and charm. "I'll pay for the window. I'll hire the best contractor in the city to fix it tonight. I'll say it was an accident. We were rearranging furniture to make room for the baby's things, and I lost my grip on the chair." "And the neighbors who heard you screaming at me?" Rebecca asked, surprised by the steady tone of her own voice. "Sound carries weird at night. The acoustics in this neighborhood are strange because of how the houses are positioned. They couldn't have heard what we were actually saying to each other." Rebecca felt the baby kick again, harder this time, as if protesting the stress hormones that were flooding her bloodstream. She realized with sudden, devastating clarity that for months, possibly years, her unborn child had been absorbing the toxic environment of their marriage. The constant tension that filled their house like poisonous gas. The way she walked on eggshells around Garrett's moods. The way she held her breath whenever his key turned in the front door lock, trying to read his emotional state from the sound of his footsteps. What kind of prenatal environment was she providing for her daughter? What kind of stress hormones was she bathing her developing child in every single day? I need to sit down properly, she said, feeling dizzy as the adrenaline began to wear off and shock set in. Don't you dare faint on me right now, Garrett snapped, then immediately tried to soften his tone when he realized how harsh he sounded. I mean, are you okay? Do you need water? Should I get you something to eat? The sirens stopped directly outside their house, followed by the slam of multiple car doors and the crackle of police radios. Garrett's face went completely white as he realized there was no hiding from this anymore. No spinning it, no controlling the narrative. Multiple units responding to domestic disturbance with possible weapons involved, a voice called out from their front yard, clear and authoritative. Weapons? Garrett's voice cracked like a teenager's. They think I have weapons? Why would they think that? Rebecca remembered the gun cabinet in his office, the hunting rifles he had insisted on buying for home protection, even though they lived in one of the safest neighborhoods in the city. He had claimed it was about preparedness, about being able to protect his family if society ever collapsed or if crime rates in their area ever increased. But looking back now, she wondered if the guns had always been about power and control, like everything else in Garrett's world. A loud, authoritative knock echoed through the house. Police! We need to speak with the residents of this address. Garrett looked at Rebecca with desperate eyes that held a mixture of panic, anger, and something that might have been genuine fear. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'll get help. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anger management classes. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But please don't let them destroy everything I've worked for. Please don't let them ruin our family. Rebecca stood up slowly, still holding the bloody dish towel to her arm. Through the broken window, she could see neighbors gathering on the street despite the late hour and cold weather. Some were holding cell phones, recording everything for social media. Others were talking to police officers, probably describing what they had heard and seen over the months and years of living next door to the Morrisons. Mrs. Chen from across the street was gesturing animatedly toward their house, no doubt describing the loud arguments that had become a regular feature of neighborhood life. The teenage boy from 2 houses down was live streaming on his phone, probably posting to TikTok or Instagram with hashtags about domestic violence and millionaire scandals. For 4 years, she had protected Garrett's reputation by hiding his explosive temper from the outside world. She had made excuses for his behavior to her family, covered for his controlling tendencies with their few remaining friends, and gradually lost herself in the process of managing his image and his emotions. But sitting in a kitchen full of broken glass while 7 months pregnant, she finally understood something crucial about the dynamic of their relationship. She wasn't protecting him anymore. She was enabling him. The baby kicked again, and Rebecca placed her hand over her belly, feeling the strong, steady movement of new life that deserved better than this. I won't let you grow up thinking this is normal, she whispered to her unborn daughter. What did you say? Garrett asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. She looked at him, this man she had once loved, this person she had planned to spend her life with, and saw him clearly for the first time in years. Not through the filter of his manipulation or her own desperate hope that he would change. Not through the lens of financial dependence or social expectations or the sunk cost fallacy of 4 years invested in trying to make their marriage work. She saw him as he really was, a man who had just thrown a chair at her head while she was pregnant with his child. I said I'm done protecting you from the consequences of your actions. And with that declaration, the first time in 4 years she had refused to enable his behavior, Rebecca Morrison walked toward the front door, leaving Garrett standing alone in their destroyed kitchen as police officers waited outside to change both their lives forever. This is SWAT. We have the house surrounded. Officer Janet Sullivan arrived at the Morrison residence to find 3 patrol cars already positioned strategically around the property, their red and blue lights painting the impressive mansion in alternating colors that made the whole scene look like something from a movie. As the lead crisis negotiator for the city police department, Janet had responded to hundreds of domestic violence calls over her 15-year career, but she had learned that wealthy neighborhoods required a different approach than the typical domestic disputes she handled. Rich men had more to lose, which often made them more unpredictable when cornered. They were accustomed to solving problems with money and influence, and when those tools failed them, they sometimes escalated to violence with a desperation that could be extremely dangerous for everyone involved. The Morrison house sat on 2 pristine acres of professionally landscaped grounds, giving the tactical team significant advantages for positioning and containment, but also creating multiple potential hiding spots if the situation escalated into a hostage scenario or if the subject attempted to flee. Janet studied the property layout on her tablet while receiving a briefing from the first responding officers who had secured the perimeter. Neighbors report seeing the male subject throw furniture at his pregnant wife approximately 20 minutes ago, Officer Martinez reported, his voice carrying the professional calm that came from years of experience with domestic violence calls. The wife appears to be injured, but mobile. Multiple witnesses confirmed they heard prolonged shouting and verbal altercations before the incident escalated to physical violence. Any prior calls to this address? Janet asked, knowing that domestic violence rarely occurred in isolation. Most abusers had long histories of escalating behavior before they reached the point of throwing chairs at pregnant wives. 3 noise complaints filed in the past year by different neighbors. No arrests made, but patrol notes indicate escalating domestic disputes with increasing frequency. The husband is Garrett Morrison, age 34, CEO of TechFlow Solutions. The wife is Rebecca Morrison, age 28, approximately 7 months pregnant, according to witnesses. Janet nodded grimly. She had 3 children of her own and knew from both professional experience and personal understanding how pregnancy could trigger abusive men who feared losing control over their victims. The prospect of a baby demanding attention, changing family dynamics, and requiring financial resources often pushed controlling partners over the edge into outright violence. What about weapons? Multiple neighbors have confirmed they can see what appears to be an extensive rifle collection displayed in what looks like the subject's home office. We're treating this as an armed and potentially dangerous situation. SWAT is positioned and ready to breach if necessary, but we're hoping negotiation will resolve this peacefully. Inside the house, Garrett watched police cars multiply outside his windows, like a nightmare coming to life in slow motion. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he realized that neighbors were not only watching the drama unfold, but actively recording everything with their smartphones. By morning, this would be trending on every social media platform. His board of directors would see it, his investors would see it, his competitors would use it to destroy him. His carefully crafted image as a successful tech entrepreneur, the golden boy who had built a $50 million company from nothing, the visionary who was about to take his company public in what was being called one of the most anticipated IPOs of the year, would be destroyed by one moment of lost control. "This is insane," he muttered, pacing frantically between windows to track the movements of the officers outside. "They're treating me like some kind of violent criminal, like I'm a threat to society." Rebecca had moved to the kitchen island, putting some distance between herself and the broken glass scattered across the floor. Blood had soaked through the dish towel she was holding against her arm, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from the combination of blood loss, shock, and the stress hormones flooding her system. "Maybe you should just go talk to them," she suggested quietly, her voice carrying none of the placating tone she had used for years to manage his moods. "Explain what happened. Tell them it was an accident." "Explain what exactly?" Garrett's voice cracked with panic. "That I lost my temper and threw a chair. That I had a moment of poor judgment because I was stressed about business. Do you have any idea what that will do to my company's stock price? We go public in 3 weeks, Rebecca. 3 weeks. I've worked 15 years to get to this point." She looked at him with growing clarity, seeing past the panic to the underlying self-absorption that had always defined their relationship. Even now, surrounded by police officers because he had nearly killed her and their unborn child, Garrett's primary concern was his business reputation and financial success. Not her safety, not their baby's well-being, not the fact that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His iPhone buzzed with an incoming call, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's Bill," he said, referring to his lawyer and longtime friend, Bill Crawford. "I need to take this. Maybe he can help us figure out how to handle this situation." "Garrett, do not answer the door," Bill Crawford said immediately when Garrett accepted the call. "Do not say anything to anyone until I get there. This situation is still manageable, but only if we control the narrative from the very beginning." "Manageable?" Garrett's voice rose to near hysteria. "There are 6 police cars outside my house. My neighbors are filming everything and posting it online. Half of Silicon Valley is probably watching this unfold on social media right now. How the hell is this manageable?" "Listen to me very carefully," Bill said in the tone he used for high-stakes negotiations. "This was an accident. You were moving furniture around, preparing the house for the baby, and the chair slipped from your hands. It went through the window by accident. Your wife was never in any danger. That's the story, and you stick to it no matter what anyone asks you." Garrett looked across the kitchen at Rebecca, who was staring at him with an expression he had never seen before. Not the fear he was accustomed to seeing when his temper flared. Not the compliance he expected when he needed her to support his version of events. Something else entirely. Something that made his chest tighten with a panic that had nothing to do with the police cars outside. "I don't think she's going to back me up on this," he whispered into the phone. There was a long pause. "Then we have a serious problem. Without her corroboration, this looks exactly like what it appears to be. Domestic violence against a pregnant woman. With your company going public next month, that's not just a legal problem. It's a career-ending scandal that will destroy everything you've built. What do I do?" "You convince her that supporting you is in her best interest too. Remind her about the life you've built together. Remind her about the financial security you provide. Remind her that destroying your career will hurt her and the baby as much as it hurts you." Outside, Janet Sullivan finished establishing the tactical perimeter and prepared to make initial contact with the subjects inside the house. She had dealt with enough wealthy, powerful men to know they often believed their money and status could solve any problem, including assault charges. But domestic violence cases involving pregnant women carried serious legal penalties, and judges rarely showed leniency regardless of the perpetrator's bank account or social standing. The viral nature of the incident, already spreading across social media platforms, would make it impossible for the prosecutor's office to quietly plea bargain this away. Public pressure would demand accountability, especially given the stark visual evidence of a chair flying through a window while a pregnant woman cowered in the kitchen. "Mr. Morrison," Janet called through a bullhorn, her voice carrying clearly through the cold night air. "This is Officer Sullivan with the City Police Department. We need to speak with you and your wife to make sure everyone is safe. Can you please come to the front door?" Garrett's heart pounded as he realized there was no avoiding this confrontation anymore. Through the broken window, he could see neighbors continuing to gather despite police attempts to maintain a perimeter. Someone was live streaming on TikTok. Another neighbor was being interviewed by what looked like a local news crew that had arrived with remarkable speed. His worst nightmare was unfolding in real time, broadcast to the world. "We're fine," he shouted back, his voice cracking with stress. "There's been a misunderstanding. My wife and I were rearranging furniture to prepare for our baby, and a chair accidentally slipped from my hands and went through our window. No one was hurt. It was just an accident." Janet exchanged glances with her partner. The man's voice carried obvious deception and stress, and they could clearly see blood on the woman's arm through their binoculars. His explanation, furniture rearranging at 10 o'clock on a weeknight, was implausible at best. "Sir, we need to verify the safety and well-being of both you and your wife," Janet replied. "Can you please come to the front door so we can speak with you directly?" "I'm calling my lawyer first," Garrett shouted back. "I know my rights. I don't have to talk to anyone until my legal representation arrives." Red flag. In Janet's extensive experience, innocent people involved in genuine accidents didn't immediately demand lawyers during routine welfare checks, especially when their pregnant wives were visibly injured and bleeding. Rebecca listened to this exchange and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not the baby moving, but something deeper, a psychological shift that felt like tectonic plates realigning after years of pressure. For 4 years, she had been complicit in maintaining Garrett's public image while enduring his private abuse. She had learned to explain away his explosive temper to concerned friends. She had become expert at making excuses for his controlling behavior to her family. She had perfected the art of presenting their marriage as successful and happy to the outside world, while navigating an increasingly dangerous emotional minefield at home. But sitting in their destroyed kitchen with police lights flashing through broken glass, she realized something profound that would change everything. The world was finally seeing what she had been hiding for years, and she was exhausted from hiding it. For the first time in 4 years, she had witnesses to his behavior. Police officers trained to recognize the patterns of domestic abuse. Neighbors who had heard him screaming at her month after month. Social media documenting everything in real time with a permanent record that couldn't be manipulated or explained away. The isolation that Garrett had built around her was cracking open like their window, letting in light and air and the possibility that she didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Your wife needs medical attention. We know she's bleeding. Janet Sullivan's voice cut through the night air with practiced authority, carrying the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of talking people through their worst moments. She had positioned herself strategically near the broken window, where she could maintain visual contact with Rebecca Morrison, and what she observed through her binoculars concerned her deeply on multiple levels. The woman's arm was still bleeding steadily, requiring more than basic first aid. More concerning was Rebecca's overall demeanor, the hyper-vigilant posture of someone who had learned to constantly monitor threats, the protective stance that kept one hand permanently positioned over her pregnant belly, the way she tracked her husband's movements around the kitchen with the wariness of prey watching a predator. As a mother of 3 children and a 15-year veteran of domestic violence response, Janet recognized all the signs. This wasn't an isolated incident of furniture moving gone wrong, as the husband claimed. This was the visible explosion of a pattern of abuse that had likely been building for years. "Everything's fine," Garrett shouted back from inside the house, his voice carrying the particular strain that came from trying to project normalcy while experiencing complete internal panic. "My wife cut herself on broken glass when the chair accidentally went through the window, but it's just a small scratch. We don't need medical attention. We can handle this ourselves." Janet wasn't buying any of it. Through her binoculars, she could see that the cut on Rebecca's arm was deep enough to require professional medical care, possibly stitches. Blood was soaking through multiple layers of fabric, indicating significant bleeding that wouldn't stop with simple pressure. More troubling was the way Rebecca had positioned herself, as far from her husband as possible while remaining in the kitchen, with clear sight lines to multiple exits. Body language that spoke of years of experience with an unpredictable and dangerous partner. "Mr. Morrison," Janet called out, adjusting her tone to project both authority and reasonableness. "I can see from here that your wife is injured and needs medical attention. I'm going to need to speak with her directly to verify her condition and determine what kind of medical assistance she requires." Inside the house, Garrett's panic was escalating by the minute. His lawyer, Bill Crawford, was en route, but the drive from downtown would take at least 25 minutes in late evening traffic. 25 minutes during which his carefully constructed world could crumble completely and irreversibly. Every second that passed meant more neighbors gathering outside, more social media posts gaining traction, more potential investors and board members seeing their golden boy CEO surrounded by police cars because he had thrown a chair at his pregnant wife's head. "Rebecca," he said urgently, moving closer to her, despite the way she instinctively leaned away from his approach. "You need to tell them this was an accident. Tell them we were rearranging furniture to make space for the baby's room, and the chair slipped from my hands. Tell them you're fine, and we don't need any outside help." Rebecca looked at him with eyes that seemed to be seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The adrenaline from the immediate crisis was beginning to wear off, replaced by a strange sense of clarity that felt almost surreal. For the first time in their marriage, she had witnesses to his behavior. Not just any witnesses, but police officers trained to recognize patterns of domestic abuse. Neighbors who had been hearing their arguments for months. Social media users who were documenting everything in real time. The world was watching now, and Garrett couldn't control the narrative the way he controlled everything else in their lives. "Ma'am," Janet's voice came through the broken window, speaking directly to Rebecca with a kind of gentle authority that invited honesty. "Can you hear me clearly?" Rebecca stood up slowly, still holding the blood-soaked dish towel to her arm. Moving sent sharp pain through her body, not just from the glass cut, but from the tension she had been carrying in her shoulders and back for months, maybe years. "Yes," she called back, her voice sounding stronger than she felt. "I can hear you. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" This was the moment. Rebecca understood with perfect clarity that her next words would determine not just the outcome of tonight's crisis, but the entire trajectory of her future and her unborn child's life. She could lie, as she had lied dozens of times before to friends and family members who asked about suspicious bruises or concerning changes in her behavior. She could protect Garrett's reputation one more time, enabling his abuse to continue and likely escalate after their daughter was born. She could maintain the facade that had cost her so much to build and maintain. Or she could tell the truth. "I'm bleeding," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the night air, with a steadiness that surprised her. "And I think I need to go to the hospital. The cut is deeper than it looks, and I'm starting to feel dizzy." Garrett's face went white with rage, then red with panic. "Rebecca, don't do this!" he hissed, his voice low enough that the officers outside couldn't hear him, but intense enough to carry all the menace he intended. "Think carefully about what you're destroying. Think about our life together. Think about our future." But for the first time in their marriage, Rebecca wasn't thinking primarily about protecting him or managing his emotions or preserving his reputation. She was thinking about the baby growing inside her, absorbing stress hormones every time Garrett exploded into rage. She was thinking about the pattern of escalation that had brought them to this moment, from verbal abuse to emotional control, to financial manipulation, to tonight's physical violence. She was thinking about the chair that had missed her head by inches, and what would have happened if his aim had been slightly different. "Ma'am," Janet continued, her voice maintaining the same gentle but authoritative tone, "do you feel safe where you are right now?" The question hung in the cold night air like a challenge to everything Rebecca had been telling herself for 4 years. Safe. When was the last time she had felt truly safe in her own home? When was the last time she hadn't monitored Garrett's moods, chosen her words carefully to avoid triggering his anger, walked on emotional eggshells to maintain peace? She looked around their destroyed kitchen, at the glass scattered across expensive Italian tiles, at the gaping hole where their window used to be, at her husband whose face was contorted with a mixture of fury and desperation, even as police officers surrounded their house with weapons and tactical equipment. She hesitated, but not out of uncertainty. She hesitated because she wanted to choose her words carefully, to communicate not just her immediate answer, but the deeper truth about what her life had become. The silence stretched between her and the officers outside while neighbors held their breath and news vans continued to arrive at the subdivision entrance. Social media feeds exploded with speculation and live streams. Garrett Morrison, the golden boy of the tech industry, was having his worst moment broadcast to thousands of viewers in real time. "Mrs. Morrison," Janet said gently, drawing on her own experience as a mother and her professional training in trauma-informed communication, "I'm a parent too. I understand that situations like this are complicated, especially when you're pregnant and thinking about your family's future. But my only concern right now is making sure you and your baby are safe. Can you tell me honestly, do you feel safe in your current situation?" Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to her pregnant belly, feeling the strong kicks of her daughter responding to the stress hormones flooding her system. Inside her womb, her child was experiencing every moment of this crisis, every spike of adrenaline, every wave of fear and anger and desperation. What kind of prenatal environment was she providing? What kind of stress was she subjecting her unborn daughter to by staying in this marriage? She thought about all the nights she had lain awake wondering if Garrett's emotional abuse would eventually become physical. She thought about the holes he had punched in walls during arguments, always carefully positioned where guests wouldn't see them. She thought about the dishes he had thrown and broken when dinner wasn't ready on time, or when she had questioned his business decisions. She thought about the way he grabbed her wrists during fights, hard enough to leave bruises that she covered with long sleeves and makeup. She thought about the chair flying past her head with enough force to kill her and her unborn child. "No," she said quietly at first, then louder with growing conviction. "No, I don't feel safe." Those 5 words, simple, honest, devastatingly clear, shattered Garrett's world completely. Within seconds of her admission, Janet's team was moving into tactical positions. The front door would need to be approached carefully, with medical personnel standing by to treat Rebecca's injuries and assess her condition. "You just destroyed everything," Garrett said, his voice hollow with shock and disbelief. 4 years of marriage, my company that I built from nothing, my reputation in the industry, our financial future, everything we worked for, everything I sacrificed to build for us." Rebecca looked at him through eyes that were no longer clouded by fear, manipulation, or the desperate hope that he would somehow transform into the man she had originally fallen in love with. She saw him exactly as he was, a man who had just thrown a chair at her head while she was pregnant with his child, who was more concerned about his business reputation than her safety, who viewed her honesty about feeling unsafe as a betrayal rather than a cry for help. "No, Garrett," she said with a calmness that surprised them both. "You destroyed it when you threw that chair at my head." For the first time in 4 years of marriage, she wasn't taking responsibility for his actions. She wasn't making excuses for his behavior. She wasn't protecting him from the natural consequences of his choices. She wasn't enabling him anymore. Outside, Janet Sullivan coordinated the next phase of the operation while maintaining her primary focus on the pregnant woman who had just found the courage to speak her truth in the face of enormous personal and financial pressure. It was a truth that would change everything, not just for tonight, but for the rest of both their lives. For the first time in years, Rebecca Morrison felt something she had almost forgotten existed. She felt free. "If you come in here, I'll tell them you're lying about everything." Garrett's desperation had reached heights that would have been unimaginable to him just hours earlier, when his biggest concern was a failed funding round that had cost his company $2 million. Now, as he watched police officers positioning themselves around his property and medical personnel preparing to enter his home, he realized that his entire world was disintegrating in real time. His business partners were undoubtedly watching this unfold on social media right now. Screenshots of police cars surrounding his mansion were probably being shared in every tech industry group chat and professional networking forum in Silicon Valley. His company's board of directors would see the viral videos before morning. The investors who had been evaluating his IPO would pull their support permanently. Everything he had built over 15 years of relentless work was crumbling because of one moment of lost control, one chair thrown in anger, one pregnant wife who refused to protect his reputation above her own safety. "Rebecca, please," he begged, his voice cycling between desperation and anger with disturbing speed. "Think about our life together. Think about everything we've accomplished as a team. Think about the house, the cars, the vacations, the financial security I provided. One bad night doesn't erase 4 years of marriage and partnership." She looked down at his hands as he gestured frantically, hands that had signed million-dollar contracts and commanded boardrooms full of venture capitalists, hands that had caressed her face during their early courtship when he was still pretending to be someone capable of genuine love. Hands that had just hurled a 20-pound chair at her head while she stood pregnant in their kitchen. For so long she had believed his version of their relationship, that she was lucky to have married such a successful man, that his financial support compensated for his emotional abuse, that his explosive temper was just the inevitable cost of being married to someone under the kind of pressure that came with building a tech empire. But sitting in their destroyed kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his violence, she finally saw the truth about what they had actually built together. "What exactly have we accomplished, Garrett?" she asked, her voice carrying a steadiness that seemed to surprise them both. "Because looking around right now, I see broken glass, blood on my arm, and police cars in our driveway. If this is success, if this is partnership, then I don't want it anymore." His grip on her uninjured arm tightened, his fingers pressing hard enough to leave new bruises that would join the fading ones on her wrists from their argument 3 days earlier. "You don't mean that. You're in shock from the accident. You're not thinking clearly about the bigger picture." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," she said, and realized it was completely true. Outside, Janet Sullivan was coordinating with medical personnel and tactical officers while maintaining visual contact with the increasingly volatile situation inside the Morrison house. Through her binoculars, she could see the man's body language becoming more agitated as his attempts to control the situation and his wife continued to fail. In her experience, this was often the most dangerous phase of domestic violence interventions, when the abuser realized that their usual tactics were no longer effective. "Ma'am," Janet called out, her voice projecting calm authority despite the complexity of the situation. "We have paramedics standing by to assess your injuries. Can you safely move toward the front door?" Rebecca started to stand and move toward the entryway, but Garrett immediately blocked her path, his body language shifting from pleading to threatening in a way that made her instinctively step backward. The sudden movement sent sharp pain through her injured arm and made her dizzy with the combination of blood loss and stress hormones. "You're not going anywhere until you understand what you're doing to our future," he said, his voice taking on the cold, controlled tone she had learned to fear more than his explosive anger. "Until you really comprehend the consequences of what you're throwing away." "Our future?" Rebecca felt the baby kick violently in response to her elevated heart rate and stress levels. "What future are you talking about, Garrett? One where you throw furniture at me every time your business deals go wrong? Where I spend the rest of my life walking on eggshells around your temper? Where our daughter grows up thinking it's normal for fathers to terrorize mothers? I made one mistake, one moment of poor judgment because I was under incredible stress, and you're willing to throw away everything we built because of it?" She stared at him in disbelief, recognizing the narcissistic abuse pattern that had defined their entire relationship, but seeing it clearly for the first time. "One mistake? Garrett, you've been emotionally abusing me for years. You systematically isolated me from my friends by creating drama every time I tried to maintain relationships. You convinced me to quit a job I loved by making me feel guilty for not supporting your career. You took control of all our finances so I would be completely dependent on you for every single purchase, every decision, every aspect of my daily life." Her voice was gaining strength as she finally articulated what she had never been able to say before. "You've punched holes in walls during arguments, always positioned where guests wouldn't see them. You've thrown dishes and broken furniture when I didn't meet your expectations. You've grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises that I covered with makeup and long sleeves. And tonight, you threw a chair at my head while I'm 7 months pregnant with your child. I wasn't aiming for your head. How many times do I have to tell you that? That doesn't make it better. That makes it worse. You were so out of control, so consumed with rage, that you threw heavy furniture without caring where it went or who it might hurt." The baby's movements became increasingly frantic, and Rebecca felt sharp, cramping pain radiating from her lower back around to her abdomen. The stress of the confrontation, combined with the physical trauma of nearly being killed by flying furniture, was pushing her body toward a crisis that could endanger both her and her unborn daughter. She doubled over, gasping, as the cramping intensified into something that felt dangerously similar to early labor contractions. "What's wrong?" Garrett's anger immediately shifted to panic as he watched her bend forward in obvious pain. "What's happening to you?" I think I'm having contractions," Rebecca said between labored breaths, her voice tight with pain and fear. "Real ones, not just stress cramps." Through the broken window, Janet observed Rebecca's distress and immediately signaled for emergency medical intervention. Pregnant women under extreme stress could go into premature labor, and at 7 months gestation, the baby would need immediate specialized medical care to survive outside the womb. "Mr. Morrison," Janet called urgently, her voice cutting through the night air with new intensity. "We need to get your wife medical attention immediately. Please open the front door and allow our paramedics to assess her condition." But Garrett found himself frozen between competing priorities that revealed the true nature of his character. Opening the door meant arrest, public humiliation, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of his company and reputation. But refusing to allow medical help could mean losing his wife and child to preventable complications. For a man who claimed to love his family above all else, the fact that he hesitated at all spoke volumes about what he actually valued most. Rebecca's pain intensified, the contractions coming in waves that radiated from her lower back around to her abdomen with increasing frequency and intensity. These weren't the false contractions brought on by stress that she had experienced earlier in her pregnancy. Her body was responding to trauma by preparing to deliver a baby who was still 10 weeks away from full-term development. "Garrett," she gasped between contractions, "I need to get to the hospital right now. Something's wrong. This doesn't feel normal." He looked at her, then at the police cars surrounding their house, then back at her, his face cycling through emotions with disturbing rapidity. For a brief moment, she could see the man she had originally fallen in love with, concerned, protective, genuinely caring about her well-being. But that version of Garrett disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the calculating narcissist who viewed everything, including medical emergencies, through the lens of how it affected his own interests. "This is your fault," he said suddenly, his concern evaporating back into blame with breathtaking speed. "The stress of fighting with me, of refusing to support me when I needed you most, of questioning my judgment and my authority in our relationship. That's what's causing this. If you had just been the wife I needed you to be, if you had just trusted me to handle our finances and our future, none of this would be happening." Even while experiencing what might be premature labor, Rebecca recognized the manipulation tactic. He was making her responsible for his actions, as he had done throughout their entire marriage. Every fight was her fault for not being supportive enough. Every explosion of anger was her fault for pushing him too far. Every incident of abuse was her fault for not managing his emotions better. But this time, with pain cutting through her ability to rationalize or make excuses, the technique didn't work. Physical crisis had a way of stripping away psychological manipulation, revealing truth with brutal clarity. "Help me," she said simply, her voice carrying both pain and absolute finality, "or get out of my way." When he hesitated, when he actually stood there weighing her medical emergency against his reputation management, she made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Despite the contractions, despite the bleeding cut on her arm, despite being 7 months pregnant and possibly going into premature labor, Rebecca Morrison walked toward their front door to save herself and her unborn child. Behind her, Garrett realized that his control over her was completely and irreversibly gone. The money, the manipulation, the systematic isolation that had worked for 4 years were powerless against a woman who had finally chosen her own survival and her child's safety over his reputation and comfort. As she reached for the door handle, he made one last desperate attempt to maintain the dynamic that had defined their marriage. "If you walk out that door, we're finished," he said, his voice carrying the cold threat she had learned to fear. "I'll fight you for custody of our daughter. I'll use every resource I have, hire the best lawyers in the country to prove you're an unfit mother who made false accusations against me out of spite. I'll make sure you get nothing in the divorce. No house, no car, no money, no security. I'll destroy your reputation the way you're destroying mine. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." Rebecca paused with her hand on the doorknob, feeling another contraction building in intensity. She turned back to look at the man who had promised to love and protect her, who was now threatening to destroy her for refusing to protect him from the consequences of his own violence. "Garrett," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute finality, "we were finished the moment you threw that chair at my head." And with that declaration of independence, the first time in 4 years she had refused to prioritize his needs above her own safety, she opened the door and walked into the flashing lights of police cars, into the chaos of media attention, into the uncertainty of single motherhood and legal battles. She walked into freedom. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to get you to a hospital immediately." The moment Rebecca opened the front door of her mansion, Janet Sullivan's team moved into action with the coordinated efficiency that came from years of experience handling domestic violence crises. 2 paramedics rushed to Rebecca's side while SWAT officers moved to secure Garrett, who had followed his wife outside in a final, desperate attempt to maintain control over the narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond his influence. The contrast between the couple was stark and telling. Rebecca, despite being injured and in obvious physical distress, moved with the purposeful determination of someone who had finally chosen action over paralysis. Garrett, despite being physically uninjured, appeared completely disoriented by his sudden loss of control over the situation he had created. "Ma'am, I'm Sarah Chen, lead paramedic," the first responder said as she quickly began assessing Rebecca's condition with practiced efficiency. "Can you tell me about your symptoms? I understand you're approximately 7 months pregnant." "Yes, I'm 28 weeks along," Rebecca replied, her voice tight with pain as another contraction gripped her abdomen. "I started having contractions about 15 minutes ago, and they're getting stronger and more frequent. They don't feel like the false labor I experienced earlier in my pregnancy." "Any bleeding? Any fluid leakage?" Sarah asked while checking Rebecca's vital signs and examining the cut on her arm that was still bleeding steadily. "No bleeding below, but I cut my arm on glass when my husband threw a chair through our kitchen window. It missed my head by just a few inches." Rebecca's voice remained remarkably steady as she described the incident, as if speaking the truth aloud was somehow liberating after years of covering up and making excuses. The paramedics exchanged meaningful glances. Domestic violence during pregnancy was not only a serious risk factor for premature labor and pregnancy complications, but it also significantly increased the likelihood of future escalation. Statistics showed that pregnant women were more likely to be killed by their partners than to die from any pregnancy-related medical condition. "We need to get you to the hospital right away," Sarah said while her partner prepared the stretcher, "both for the contractions and to properly assess and treat your arm injury. You're going to need stitches, and we want to make sure there's no glass embedded in the wound." Meanwhile, Garrett found himself in handcuffs for the first time in his privileged life, an experience so foreign and humiliating that he couldn't quite process the reality of what was happening to him. The metal restraints felt impossible against his wrists. He was Garrett Morrison, CEO of a $50 million company, featured on magazine covers, invited to speak at tech conferences around the world. "This is a mistake," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen, his voice taking on the entitled tone that had served him well in boardrooms, but sounded pathetic in the context of domestic violence arrest. "I'm a successful businessman. I've never been in trouble with the law. I have no history of violence. This was an accident that got blown completely out of proportion." Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who had arrived just as Rebecca was being loaded into the ambulance, had seen hundreds of cases exactly like this one over her 12-year career, specializing in domestic violence. Wealthy, successful men who genuinely believed their social status and financial resources insulated them from consequences for abusing their wives. "Mr. Morrison," she said with the calm professionalism that made her effective at her job, "you're under arrest for assault in the second degree. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Assault?" Garrett's voice cracked with disbelief. "I never touched her. The chair didn't even make contact with her body. How can you arrest me for assault when I didn't actually hit anyone?" "Sir, under state law, throwing objects at another person constitutes assault regardless of whether contact is made. The intent to cause harm or create fear of imminent harm is sufficient for charges. The fact that your wife is pregnant makes this a felony charge with enhanced penalties." Garrett's legs nearly gave out as the legal reality of his situation hit him with devastating force. Felony assault, criminal record. His company's board of directors would remove him immediately to protect their own liability. The IPO would be canceled, costing investors millions and permanently destroying his reputation in the tech industry. His career was over. His fortune would be consumed by legal fees and civil settlements. Everything he had spent his adult life building was dissolving because he had lost control for 30 seconds in his kitchen. At the hospital, Rebecca was rushed into the emergency department, where Dr. Patricia Holbrook, an experienced emergency physician with over 20 years of treating domestic violence victims, took immediate charge of her care. Dr. Holbrook had learned that creating a safe, non-judgmental environment was essential for helping victims feel secure enough to disclose the full extent of their abuse. "Rebecca, I'm Dr. Holbrook," she said while quickly reviewing the paramedics' notes and assessing Rebecca's condition. "I want you to know that you're safe here. Hospital policy prohibits anyone from entering your room without your explicit permission, and we have security officers available if you need them. My only concern right now is making sure you and your baby are healthy." For the first time in hours, possibly years, Rebecca felt herself truly relax. The constant hypervigilance she maintained around Garrett could finally ease. She didn't have to monitor his mood or choose her words carefully to avoid triggering his anger. She didn't have to manage his emotions or take responsibility for his reactions. "How's my baby?" she asked as Dr. Holbrook prepared the ultrasound equipment to check on the fetal heartbeat and position. "Let's take a look and find out," the doctor replied, spreading gel on Rebecca's belly and positioning the ultrasound transducer. The sound of a strong, steady heartbeat immediately filled the room, and Dr. Holbrook smiled reassuringly. "There we go. Heart rate is excellent at 140 beats per minute, and the baby appears to be in the correct position. The contractions seem to be slowing down significantly now that you're in a calm, safe environment." Rebecca started crying, not from pain or fear, but from profound relief. Her baby was going to be okay. Despite everything Garrett had put them through, despite the months of stress and emotional abuse, despite tonight's violence and terror, her daughter was going to survive and be healthy. The realization hit her with overwhelming force. She had been sacrificing her child's well-being by staying in an abusive marriage. Every argument, every explosive outburst, every moment of walking on eggshells had been bathing her developing baby in stress hormones that could have lasting developmental consequences. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight and any previous incidents," Dr. Holbrook said gently. "I know it's difficult, but documenting everything accurately will be important for both your medical care and any legal proceedings." Detective Rodriguez arrived at the hospital an hour later, after Garrett had been processed and booked into the county jail on felony assault charges. She approached Rebecca's hospital bed with the gentle demeanor of someone who understood that trauma victims needed to feel in control of their own stories. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Detective Rodriguez. I specialize in domestic violence cases, and I know tonight has been traumatic for you. I need to ask you some detailed questions about what happened and any previous incidents, but only if you feel ready to talk about it." Rebecca looked at the detective, then at Dr. Holbrook, who nodded encouragingly. For 4 years, she had hidden the reality of her marriage from everyone: family, friends, colleagues, medical professionals. But sitting in a hospital bed, surrounded by people whose professional duty was to help and protect her, she realized she didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. "It wasn't the first time he lost control," she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Tonight was the first time he actually threw something at me, but it wasn't the first time I was afraid he might hurt me physically." "Can you tell me about other incidents?" Detective Rodriguez asked, taking careful notes that would become crucial evidence in the prosecution's case. Rebecca took a deep breath and began to speak about things she had never told anyone before. She described the holes Garrett had punched in their bedroom and office walls during arguments, always positioned where guests wouldn't see them. She talked about the dishes he had smashed when dinner wasn't ready on time, or when she had dared to disagree with his decisions. She described the way he grabbed her wrists during fights, hard enough to leave distinctive fingerprint bruises that she had carefully covered with makeup and long sleeves. But the physical incidents were just the visible tip of a much larger pattern of abuse. Rebecca found herself describing the systematic emotional and psychological control that had gradually stripped away her independence, her confidence, and her sense of self. "He convinced me to quit my job about 6 months after we got married," she said, the words coming easier now. "He made it seem like he needed my support to focus on building his company, like my career was somehow selfish and unsupportive. But looking back, I think he needed me to be financially dependent on him so I couldn't leave." She talked about how Garrett had taken control of their finances, requiring her to ask permission for even small purchases while spending freely on his own interests. She described how he had systematically interfered with her friendships, creating drama and conflict whenever she tried to maintain relationships outside their marriage. "He never hit me before tonight," she said, "but I was always afraid he would, especially after I got pregnant. He started getting angry about the idea of sharing my attention with a baby. He would make comments about how children ruin marriages, how women become different after they have kids, how he wasn't sure he was ready to come second in my priorities." Detective Rodriguez took careful notes, recognizing the classic patterns of coercive control that often preceded physical violence. "Rebecca, what you're describing is a specific type of domestic abuse called coercive control. It's designed to make victims dependent and compliant through isolation, financial manipulation, and psychological pressure. Combined with tonight's assault, we have grounds for multiple serious charges. What happens to Garrett now? Rebecca asked. That depends partly on your willingness to cooperate with the prosecution. Are you prepared to testify about the pattern of abuse you've described? Rebecca thought about her daughter, still growing safely in her womb despite everything that had happened. She thought about the kind of world she wanted to create for her child, one where women didn't have to accept abuse in exchange for financial security, where children didn't grow up thinking violence was a normal part of relationships. She thought about other women who might be married to men like Garrett, trapped by the same patterns of manipulation and control that had held her for so long. Yes, she said with absolute certainty, I'll testify. Someone needs to hold him accountable for his actions, and someone needs to speak up for women who are still too afraid to speak for themselves. For the first time in 4 years, Rebecca Morrison was taking complete control of her own story. The woman who had spent so long protecting her abuser from consequences was finally ready to protect herself and her child instead. The truth she discovered was both terrifying and liberating in ways she had never imagined possible. The video already has 2 million views and counting. Bill Crawford delivered this devastating news to Garrett through the bulletproof glass partition of the county jail's attorney-client visitation room, his voice carrying the weight of a friendship that had just become exponentially more complicated. As Garrett's lawyer and longtime friend since their Harvard Business School days, Bill had spent the previous 12 hours attempting damage control for a situation that was rapidly proving to be beyond anyone's ability to contain or manage. 2 million views in less than 12 hours? Garrett's voice was hoarse from a sleepless night spent in a concrete cell with 3 other inmates, an experience so far removed from his usual luxury accommodations that he still couldn't quite believe it was real. The Orange County Jail jumpsuit made him look nothing like the polished CEO who had graced the covers of Forbes and Entrepreneur magazine just months earlier. Multiple videos, actually, Bill said grimly, consulting his tablet where he had compiled a comprehensive analysis of the social media disaster his friend had created. Someone was live streaming on TikTok when the chair went through your window. The audio quality is clear enough to hear you shouting at Rebecca, then the crash, then her telling the police she didn't feel safe. That's the one that went truly viral. 2.3 million views and climbing. Garrett buried his head in his hands, the reality of his situation hitting him in waves. His entire adult identity had been built around success, control, and public image. He was the golden boy who had transformed a simple app idea into a $50 million company. He was the visionary entrepreneur that other business leaders sought out for advice. He was supposed to be the success story that inspired others to pursue their dreams. Now millions of people had seen him at his absolute worst moment, and there was no spinning this story, no managing this narrative, no buying his way out of the consequences. What about the company, he asked, though part of him already knew the answer from Bill's expression. Bill's face grew even more somber as he delivered the business news that would complete Garrett's professional destruction. The board convened an emergency session at 6 this morning. They voted unanimously to remove you as CEO effective immediately and to suspend all your voting rights and decision-making authority. The IPO has been postponed indefinitely, most likely canceled permanently. Stock price in the private market has dropped 60% since the video started circulating. Everything Garrett had worked toward for the past 15 years was dissolving in real time. TechFlow Solutions had been more than just his company. It had been his identity, his proof that he was more than just another privileged kid with family money and business school connections. The technology they had developed, the team he had assembled, the market position they had built, all of it was being destroyed by the consequences of 30 seconds of uncontrolled rage in his kitchen. And Rebecca? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She spent the night in the hospital for observation, but both she and the baby are stable. The contractions stopped once she was in a safe environment. More significantly for your legal situation, she gave a detailed, comprehensive statement to Detective Rodriguez about a pattern of domestic abuse spanning several years. Garrett's stomach dropped as the implications became clear. He had assumed, perhaps hoped, that Rebecca would follow their established pattern of minimizing his behavior and protecting his reputation once she had time to think about the bigger picture. The idea that she might actually testify against him, that she might air their private business in a public courtroom, had never seemed like a real possibility. She's upset and traumatized right now, he said desperately, grasping for any explanation that would restore his sense of control over the situation. Once she calms down and thinks rationally about our life together, she'll remember how good we had it. She'll remember everything I provided for her, the security and comfort I gave her. She'll come back. Bill looked at his oldest friend with something that approached pity. Even facing the complete destruction of his life and career, Garrett couldn't acknowledge that his behavior had been genuinely abusive. He was still rewriting history to cast himself as the victim of an ungrateful wife's vindictive lies. Garrett, she's not coming back. She's filed for divorce and requested a permanent restraining order. She's also hired Michelle Rodriguez, Detective Rodriguez's sister, who specializes in high-asset domestic violence cases. This isn't a temporary separation or a negotiating tactic. She's done with the marriage permanently. The words hit Garrett like physical blows. Divorce, restraining order, specialized attorney. These weren't the actions of a woman having second thoughts or responding emotionally to a single incident. These were the calculated moves of someone who had been planning an escape for longer than he had realized. Meanwhile, at the hospital where she had spent the night under medical observation, Rebecca was experiencing something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Despite the circumstances that had brought her here, despite the uncertainty and legal battles that lay ahead, despite the daunting prospect of single motherhood, she felt genuinely calm for the first time in months. The constant anxiety that had become her baseline emotional state, monitoring Garrett's moods, anticipating his needs, managing his reactions, had lifted like fog clearing from a landscape. She could breathe deeply without worrying about saying or doing something that might trigger an explosion of anger. Sarah Morrison, Garrett's sister, arrived at the hospital shortly after lunch, carrying flowers and wearing an expression of profound guilt and regret. The two women had maintained a polite but distant relationship throughout Rebecca's marriage, largely because Sarah had chosen to ignore the obvious warning signs of her brother's increasingly volatile behavior. "I should have said something years ago," Sarah said without preamble, as she settled into the chair beside Rebecca's hospital bed. "I knew he had serious problems with anger and control, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage." Rebecca studied her sister-in-law carefully, seeing genuine remorse and recognition in her eyes rather than the defensive loyalty she had expected. "Did you know he was abusing me?" "I suspected it, especially over the past year," Sarah admitted, her voice heavy with guilt and self-recrimination. "The way you walked on eggshells around him during family gatherings, how you always deferred to his opinions even when you obviously disagreed, the way you flinched when he moved too quickly or spoke sharply, the expensive gifts that appeared after he had been particularly difficult." Sarah's voice broke slightly as she continued. "Our father was exactly the same way. Successful and charming in public, explosive and controlling at home. Mom spent 35 years making excuses for his behavior, covering for his rages, convincing herself and everyone else that his success justified his treatment of our family." "Why didn't she leave him?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Same reasons you stayed with Garrett, I imagine. Financial dependence that he had carefully cultivated, social pressure to maintain the appearance of a successful marriage, the belief that love meant accepting abuse, that supporting your husband meant absorbing his anger without complaint." Sarah reached for Rebecca's hand. "But you're braver than she was. You're breaking a cycle that has defined the women in our family for generations." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Holbrook, who entered carrying Rebecca's discharge paperwork and wearing the satisfied expression of a physician whose patient had avoided serious complications. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked while reviewing Rebecca's overnight monitoring results. "Much better," Rebecca replied, surprised by how true that statement was. "The contractions stopped completely around 3 in the morning, and the baby has been moving normally all night." "Excellent. The stress-induced contractions have resolved, and your blood pressure has returned to normal ranges. The stitches in your arm should heal completely within 2 weeks." Dr. Holbrook pulled up a chair, signaling that this conversation would be more comprehensive than a routine discharge discussion. "I want to talk to you about something important. I've been treating domestic violence victims for over 20 years, and I've learned that leaving the abuser is often just the beginning of recovery, not the end." Have you given any thought to counseling or therapy? I don't know if I'm ready to dissect everything that happened in my marriage, Rebecca said honestly. It feels overwhelming right now. That's completely normal and understandable, but I'd like to refer you to someone who specializes in helping women recover from coercive control and emotional abuse. Dr. Jennifer Walsh has particular expertise in working with educated professional women who've experienced the type of systematic manipulation you described to Detective Rodriguez. Sarah squeezed Rebecca's hand encouragingly. It might help to talk to someone who understands what you've been through, someone who won't judge you for staying as long as you did. Rebecca nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in getting professional help to process 4 years of psychological manipulation and abuse. For too long, she had carried the burden of Garrett's behavior alone, making excuses for his actions and covering up the reality of their relationship. The idea of talking to someone who wouldn't blame her for staying, who would help her understand how she had been systematically manipulated, felt like a lifeline. Okay, she said, I'll try counseling. I think I need help figuring out who I am when I'm not managing someone else's emotions. As Dr. Holbrook finalized the discharge process, Rebecca realized she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life and shape the kind of world her daughter would grow up in. She could retreat into shame and isolation, becoming another domestic violence victim who disappeared quietly into single motherhood, grateful to have escaped with her life. Or she could use her experience, her education, and her platform to help other women recognize the warning signs she had missed for so long. For the first time since the chair flew past her head, Rebecca smiled with genuine hope. She was beginning to understand that the broken window hadn't just let the police see inside their house. It had let her see outside the prison she hadn't even realized she was living in. The path ahead would be difficult: single motherhood, legal battles, rebuilding her career and her sense of self. But for the first time in years, it was a path she was choosing for herself rather than one someone else was imposing on her. And that made all the difference in the world. I won't be there when you come home. Rebecca's voice was steady and final as she left this message on Garrett's voicemail from the safety of Sarah's guest bedroom, 3 days after the incident that had shattered more than just their kitchen window. She had moved out of the mansion with Sarah's help during the few hours when Garrett was being processed through the county jail system, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind everything else that represented the life she no longer wanted. The expensive furniture, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the art collection that Garrett had insisted would be good investments, all of it belonged to a version of herself that had been systematically erased over 4 years of emotional abuse. She felt no attachment to any of it, no sense of loss for the material comfort she was abandoning. The temporary restraining order had been granted within hours of her request, prohibiting Garrett from contacting her directly or coming within 500 feet of any location where she might be present. For the first time in years, Rebecca could move through the world without the constant awareness of someone else's mood monitoring her every action and decision. Sarah's guest room was small and simply furnished, a stark contrast to the marble and crystal opulence of the Morrison mansion. But it felt more like home than anywhere Rebecca had lived in years. The walls were painted in soft, calming blues and whites that didn't demand attention or make statements about wealth and status. There were books on the nightstand that she could read without worrying about whether her choice of literature met with someone else's approval. "How are you adjusting?" Sarah asked, bringing her a cup of herbal tea and settling into the comfortable reading chair by the window. "I feel lost," Rebecca admitted, her hand resting on her 8-month pregnant belly. "For 4 years, my entire identity was built around being Garrett's wife, managing his household, supporting his career. I don't remember who I was before I took on that role." "Who were you when you were 24? Before you met him?" Sarah prompted gently. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to remember the woman she had been before Garrett's systematic campaign to remake her into his ideal wife. "I was ambitious, independent. I had strong opinions about things and wasn't afraid to voice them, even when they were unpopular. I made my own money and my own decisions. I had friends who challenged me intellectually and supported me emotionally." "Those qualities don't disappear," Sarah said with conviction. "They just got buried under years of psychological manipulation designed to make you doubt yourself. But they're still there, waiting to be rediscovered." The process of rediscovering herself began with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the therapist Dr. Holbrook had recommended. Dr. Walsh specialized in helping domestic abuse survivors recover their sense of identity and self-worth, with particular expertise in the type of coercive control that educated, successful women often experienced. "What happened to you has a name," Dr. Walsh explained during their first session in her comfortable office, filled with plants and natural light. "It's called coercive control, and it's a pattern of behavior specifically designed to make victims dependent and compliant. The abuser systematically removes the victim's autonomy through isolation, financial manipulation, and psychological pressure." "But I'm educated," Rebecca said, voicing the shame and confusion she had been carrying. "I had a successful career before I met Garrett. I should have been smart enough to recognize what was happening to me." "Intelligence offers no protection against this type of manipulation," Dr. Walsh replied firmly. "In fact, successful, educated women are often specifically targeted by coercive controllers because they represent a greater challenge to dominate, which feeds the abuser's need for power and control. Breaking down someone who was previously strong and independent provides a more significant psychological reward." This revelation was both devastating and liberating for Rebecca. She wasn't weak or stupid for falling victim to Garrett's manipulation. She had been systematically targeted and broken down by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her strengths and turn them into vulnerabilities. "The most insidious part," Dr. Walsh continued, "is how gradually it happens. If someone had told you on your wedding day that you would spend 4 years walking on eggshells around your husband's explosive temper, you would have been horrified. But the changes happen incrementally in ways that seem reasonable or even loving at the time." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the pattern with painful clarity. "It started with small things that seemed like romantic gestures. He wanted to take care of me financially so I wouldn't have to worry about money. He wanted to spend all our free time together because he loved me so much. He had strong opinions about my friends because he was concerned about people who might be bad influences on our relationship. Each individual incident seemed manageable or even flattering," Dr. Walsh observed. "But taken together, they formed a comprehensive system of control that isolated you from support systems while making you financially and emotionally dependent on your abuser." Meanwhile, Garrett's world continued its spectacular collapse in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Released on bail but facing multiple felony charges, he returned to the empty mansion that now felt like a museum of his former life. The silence was deafening after years of Rebecca's presence managing every aspect of their domestic routine. Without her emotional labor, anticipating his needs, managing his schedule, handling his correspondence, maintaining his social calendar, Garrett discovered how much of his daily functioning had actually depended on her invisible work. The house felt foreign and uncomfortable, filled with broken glass and the echoes of his own violence. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters seeking statements about the viral video. Tech industry blogs were running speculative articles about the future of TechFlow Solutions and whether the company could survive the scandal of its founder's domestic violence arrest. His business partners were publicly distancing themselves while privately calculating their own financial losses. The board of directors had not only removed him as CEO, but were now exploring legal options to recover company resources he had used for personal expenses over the years. The corporate credit cards had been frozen. His access to company accounts had been revoked. His 15-year empire was being systematically dismantled by the same people who had once competed for his attention and approval. But perhaps more devastating than the professional destruction was the personal emptiness. Without Rebecca to blame for his problems, without her constant emotional labor to manage the practical aspects of his life, Garrett faced something he had been avoiding for years: accountability for his own actions and the reality of who he had become. His court-appointed anger management counselor was nothing like the expensive therapists he had seen in the past, the ones who had validated his belief that his success justified his behavior and that his stress levels explained his explosive reactions. Dr. Marcus Webb was a former police officer who specialized in working with domestic violence perpetrators, and he had zero patience for wealthy men who thought money absolved them of responsibility for abusing their families. "You threw a chair at your pregnant wife's head," Dr. Webb said during their first mandated session, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had heard every excuse and justification imaginable. Help me understand how you justify that action to yourself. I wasn't aiming for her head, Garrett replied, falling back on the explanation he had been repeating to anyone who would listen. I was aiming for the wall behind her, and my control was compromised because I was under extreme stress. It was a moment of poor judgment, not intentional violence. So you're telling me that your emotional regulation is so poor that you can't control your physical actions when you're upset? Dr. Webb asked, his tone making it clear that this line of reasoning would not be accepted as an excuse. Garrett hesitated, recognizing the trap in the question. He had spent years blaming his explosive behavior on external stresses, business pressure, financial concerns, Rebecca's alleged failure to be supportive enough of his career. But Dr. Webb's direct questioning made those explanations sound hollow and self-serving. I've been under unprecedented pressure lately, he said, trying to maintain some version of his victim narrative. My company was about to go public, we just lost major funding, and the stress was affecting every aspect of my life. When Rebecca suggested postponing a major real estate purchase, it felt like she was undermining my authority and judgment at the worst possible time. So when your wife offered a reasonable financial suggestion during a period of business uncertainty, your response was to throw heavy furniture at her? When you put it like that, it sounds much worse than it actually was. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Webb said with the weary patience of someone who had conducted these conversations thousands of times, it doesn't just sound bad, it is bad. You use physical intimidation and violence to punish your wife for expressing an opinion you disagreed with. That's domestic terrorism on a personal scale. The blunt assessment hit Garrett like a physical blow. He had never conceptualized his behavior as terrorism, but sitting in the sterile counselor's office facing the possibility of years in prison, he began to see his actions from Rebecca's perspective for the first time in their marriage. She had lived in fear of his moods for years, never knowing what might trigger his explosive anger. She had modified her behavior, her speech, her very personality to avoid provoking reactions that could escalate into verbal abuse or property destruction. She had sacrificed her career, her friendships, her financial independence, and ultimately her sense of self to maintain peace in a relationship where peace was always temporary and conditional on her absolute compliance. I never thought about it from her point of view, he admitted quietly. That's the core of the problem, Dr. Webb replied. Abusers are fundamentally unable to empathize with their victims because doing so would force them to acknowledge the full extent of the harm they're causing. It's psychologically easier to blame the victim for provoking the abuse than to take responsibility for choosing violence as a response to normal relationship disagreements. For the first time since his arrest, Garrett felt something other than self-pity, anger, or panic about his ruined reputation. Sitting in that office, forced to examine his behavior without the comfort of justifications and excuses, he began to experience something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Back at Sarah's house, Rebecca was making practical preparations for the new life she was building from scratch. 8 months pregnant and facing single motherhood, she needed to establish financial independence, legal representation, and a support system that didn't depend on Garrett's resources or approval. Michelle Rodriguez, the attorney specializing in high-asset domestic violence cases, had agreed to represent Rebecca in both the criminal prosecution and the divorce proceedings. During their first meeting in Michelle's downtown office, Rebecca learned that her situation was both more serious and more hopeful than she had understood. Your husband's legal team has already made several attempts to negotiate a settlement, Michelle explained, sliding a folder across the polished conference table. They're offering significant financial packages in exchange for you dropping the criminal charges and agreeing to shared custody arrangements. Rebecca opened the folder and felt her breath catch. The initial settlement offer was for $5 million, plus ownership of the mansion, plus monthly support payments that would ensure financial security for the rest of her life. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of having access to, enough to provide any kind of life she wanted for herself and her daughter. What would I have to do to accept this? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Publicly state that the chair-throwing incident was an accident caused by stress and poor judgment, rather than intentional domestic violence. Refuse to testify in the criminal case against your husband. Agree to joint custody with minimal supervision requirements. Essentially, you would be paid to recant your testimony and pretend the pattern of abuse never happened. Rebecca stared at the numbers on the page, trying to process the magnitude of what Garrett was offering to buy her silence. $5 million to pretend that 4 years of emotional abuse and one night of attempted murder had never happened. Enough money to disappear quietly into comfortable anonymity while he rebuilt his reputation and career. "He's trying to purchase my silence," she said, pushing the folder back across the table. "That's exactly what this is," Michelle confirmed. "It's not uncommon in these cases, especially when the abuser has significant financial resources. The calculation is simple. Pay enough money to make the problem disappear rather than face accountability for the abuse." "What happens if I refuse the settlement?" Michelle's expression grew serious. "The criminal case proceeds to trial, where you would need to testify about the pattern of abuse you described to Detective Rodriguez. Your husband faces up to 5 years in prison if convicted on all charges. You would likely receive less money in the divorce settlement, though you're still entitled to significant marital assets. And you would face a protracted custody battle where his lawyers will try to portray you as a vindictive ex-wife who made false accusations for financial gain." "Come here." Rebecca placed her hand on her pregnant belly, feeling her daughter's strong kicks in response to her elevated heart rate. Every decision she made now would shape the world her child would inherit, not just financially, but morally and psychologically. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Rebecca said. "Do you think I'm crazy for even considering turning down $5 million? Michelle smiled with genuine warmth and respect. "I think you're asking exactly the right questions. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy back your self-respect or guarantee your safety. More importantly, it can't protect other women from experiencing what you went through, and it can't ensure that your daughter grows up in a world where domestic violence has real consequences." That afternoon, Rebecca met with Detective Rodriguez to make her final decision about testifying in the criminal case. Over the weeks since the incident, the detective had become more than just a law enforcement officer. She was an ally in Rebecca's journey toward reclaiming her life and her voice. "I want other women to know they're not alone," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "For 4 years, I thought I was the only educated, successful woman foolish enough to stay in an abusive marriage. I want them to understand that intelligence doesn't protect you from manipulation, that financial security isn't worth sacrificing your safety, and that leaving is possible even when it seems impossible. The defense team will do everything in their power to destroy your credibility," Detective Rodriguez warned. "They'll paint you as a gold digger who made false accusations to secure a larger divorce settlement. They'll dig into every aspect of your personal life, looking for anything they can use to discredit your testimony." "Let them try," Rebecca said with a conviction that surprised them both. "I know who I am now, and I know what happened in that marriage. The truth doesn't change based on how much money someone spends trying to discredit it." Meanwhile, Garrett was learning that his wealth and influence had limits that he had never previously encountered. His legal team had exhausted every possible angle to discredit Rebecca's testimony or reduce the charges against him. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public attention made quiet plea bargaining impossible. The broken window, the viral video, the neighbor's eyewitness testimony, the hospital records documenting Rebecca's injuries, all of it supported her version of events. More damaging to his case were the additional witnesses who came forward after the story gained national attention. Rebecca's former colleagues described how dramatically her personality had changed after marrying Garrett, how a confident, outspoken professional had gradually become withdrawn and deferential. Neighbors provided statements about years of loud arguments, followed by Rebecca appearing in public with suspicious bruises or cuts that she explained away with implausible stories about accidents. The pattern of escalating abuse was so well documented that even Garrett's expensive legal team couldn't construct a credible alternative narrative. Bill Crawford, still serving as Garrett's lawyer despite their strained friendship, delivered the final reality check during a meeting in Garrett's empty mansion, surrounded by boxes of legal documents and financial records. "The prosecutor has made a final plea offer," Bill said, his voice heavy with the knowledge that their options had run out. 18 months in minimum security prison, 5 years probation, mandatory anger management and domestic violence counseling, and a permanent restraining order. You would also have to publicly acknowledge that your actions constituted domestic abuse and take full responsibility for the harm you caused. "Absolutely not," Garrett replied immediately. "I will not admit to being a domestic abuser. That label would follow me for the rest of my life, destroy any possibility of rebuilding my career or my reputation. Garrett, Bill said, with the exhausted patience of someone who had been having this conversation for weeks, if this case goes to trial, you're looking at a minimum of 5 years in prison. The jury will see that viral video of you screaming at your pregnant wife. They'll hear her testimony about years of escalating abuse, and they'll decide you're exactly the kind of wealthy, privileged man who thinks money puts him above the law. Rebecca is exaggerating the pattern of abuse to get a bigger settlement, Garrett insisted, still unable to accept responsibility for his actions. She's making our normal marital disagreements sound worse than they were to gain sympathy and financial advantage. Bill stared at his longtime friend with a mixture of frustration and genuine sadness. Even facing years in prison, even having lost everything he claimed to value, Garrett couldn't acknowledge that his behavior had been genuinely abusive. He was still rewriting history to cast himself as the victim of an ungrateful wife's vindictive lies. "There's something else you need to know," Bill said reluctantly. Rebecca turned down the $5 million settlement offer. She's proceeding with both the criminal case and the divorce. She's not interested in your money. She wants accountability and justice. Garrett's face went completely white as the implications hit him. He had been absolutely certain that enough money would make this problem disappear, as money had solved every other crisis in his privileged life. The idea that Rebecca valued something more than financial security was genuinely incomprehensible to him. "She's making the biggest mistake of her life," he said desperately. "She'll never get a better offer than this. She's throwing away her future, and our daughter's future, out of spite and vindictiveness." But Rebecca wasn't acting out of spite or vindictiveness. She was acting out of courage. The courage to choose her principles over her comfort, her integrity over financial security, her daughter's future over immediate convenience. That evening, as she felt her daughter kicking actively in response to her own elevated heart rate, Rebecca whispered a promise to her unborn child. "I'm going to make sure you grow up in a world where women don't have to choose between safety and security, where your voice matters more than anyone's money, where courage is valued more than comfort, and truth is worth more than silence." Some things she had learned through the hardest experience of her life really were more important than money, and she was finally ready to prove it. Some things matter more than money. 6 weeks after the incident that had shattered both their window and their marriage, Rebecca sat in the downtown courthouse, preparing to testify in the criminal trial of Garrett Morrison. Her daughter had been born 3 weeks earlier, a healthy, beautiful baby girl she had named Hope, and she was still adjusting to the surreal experience of being a new mother while simultaneously serving as the key witness in a high-profile domestic violence case. The media attention had been relentless. Tech CEO's pregnant wife speaks out had become a national story that transcended the usual boundaries between business news and domestic violence advocacy. Rebecca's decision to refuse the settlement money and testify against her millionaire ex-husband had inspired thousands of women to share their own stories of abuse and survival. But inspiration was a double-edged sword. The same publicity that gave her platform to help other women also made her a target for online harassment from Garrett's supporters, who painted her as a vindictive gold digger destroying a successful man's life for attention and money. "Are you ready for this?" asked Michelle Rodriguez, Rebecca's attorney, as they reviewed her testimony one final time. "Remember, the defense team will do everything they can to make you seem unstable, greedy, or vindictive. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and don't let them bait you into losing your temper." Rebecca looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her car seat, blissfully unaware of the legal battle being fought to determine her father's fate. At 3 weeks old, she was already showing signs of the strong personality that had made her kicks so forceful during pregnancy. Rebecca hoped that strength would serve her daughter well in a world where women still had to fight for the right to be believed when they spoke about abuse. "I'm ready," Rebecca said, and she meant it. "I've been preparing for this moment my entire marriage, even when I didn't realize it." The courtroom was packed with reporters, domestic violence advocates, tech industry observers, and curious members of the public who had been following the story since the viral video first appeared on social media. Rebecca could see Garrett sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the weight he had lost or the haunted expression he had developed over the months since his arrest. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of his actions, in ways that prison jumpsuit and handcuffs couldn't fully capture. For the first time in years, he wasn't the most powerful person in the room, wasn't controlling the narrative or managing everyone's perception of events. When Rebecca was called to testify, she carried hope with her to the witness stand, a decision that had sparked considerable legal debate, but ultimately been allowed by the judge as a reasonable accommodation for a nursing mother. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The pregnant woman Garrett had tried to harm was now protecting the daughter who had survived his violence. "Mrs. Morrison," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court about your marriage to the defendant?" Rebecca took a deep breath and began to speak about things she had never discussed publicly before. Not just the dramatic incident that had brought them to this courtroom, but the years of systematic abuse that had preceded it, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the financial control that had left her completely dependent on Garrett's approval for even small purchases, the emotional manipulation that had convinced her to sacrifice her career to support his ambitions. "He never hit me before that night," she testified, her voice clear and steady. "But I lived in constant fear that he might. He had punched holes in walls during arguments. He had thrown and broken dishes when he was angry. He had grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises that I covered with makeup and long sleeves. The violence was always just under the surface, and I spent years walking on eggshells trying not to trigger it." The defense team, led by one of the most expensive criminal attorneys in the state, attempted to portray Rebecca's testimony as the vindictive lies of a woman seeking financial gain through false accusations. They questioned her motives for refusing the settlement offer, suggesting that a truly abused woman would have gratefully accepted millions of dollars to escape her situation. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Morrison, that you turned down a generous settlement offer because you thought you could get more money by destroying my client's reputation in a public trial?" "No," Rebecca replied firmly. "I turned down the settlement because some things are more important than money. I wanted my daughter to grow up in a world where domestic violence has real consequences, not one where wealthy men can buy their way out of accountability for abusing their families." The courtroom fell silent at her answer, and Rebecca could see several jurors nodding in recognition of the principle she was defending. She wasn't testifying for money or revenge. She was testifying for every woman who had been told to stay silent about abuse in exchange for financial security. When the defense attorney pressed her about the pattern of abuse she had described, suggesting that normal marital disagreements were being exaggerated for dramatic effect, Rebecca's response was devastating in its simplicity. Normal marriages don't require one partner to monitor the other's mood constantly to avoid triggering explosive anger. Normal marriages don't involve financial control that makes one spouse ask permission for basic purchases. Normal marriages don't feature holes punched in walls or furniture thrown at pregnant women. I know the difference between normal conflict and systematic abuse, and what I experienced was abuse. Her testimony continued for 2 days, covering everything from the gradual erosion of her independence to the specific incident that had finally brought police to their door. She spoke about the chair flying past her head with enough force to kill her and her unborn child. She described the broken glass, the blood on her arm, the contractions that had started from the stress of nearly being murdered by the father of her baby. But perhaps most powerful was her description of the psychological impact, the way abuse had changed her from a confident, successful professional into someone who constantly questioned her own perceptions and apologized for existing. "He convinced me that I was lucky to be married to such a successful man," she testified, "that my concerns about his temper were oversensitivity on my part, that his need to control our finances was him being responsible and protective, that his explosive anger was just stress from providing for our family. It took me years to understand that none of that was normal or acceptable." The prosecution also presented testimony from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Rebecca's therapist, about the psychological patterns of coercive control and domestic abuse. Expert testimony explained how educated, successful women could become trapped in abusive relationships through systematic manipulation that gradually eroded their confidence and independence. Garrett's defense team attempted to present him as a man under extraordinary business pressure who had made a single mistake in judgment, but the evidence of long-term abuse was overwhelming. Neighbors testified about years of loud arguments. Rebecca's former colleagues described her dramatic personality change after marriage. Medical records documented injuries that were inconsistent with the innocent explanations she had provided at the time. Most damaging of all was the viral video that had started everything. Clear audio of Garrett screaming at his pregnant wife, followed by the sound of furniture crashing through glass, followed by Rebecca telling police she didn't feel safe. No amount of expensive legal maneuvering could explain away that evidence. When Garrett was called to testify in his own defense, his performance on the witness stand revealed exactly why his lawyers had tried to avoid putting him before a jury. Unable to accept responsibility for his actions or show genuine remorse for the harm he had caused, he came across as entitled and self-pitying. "I was under enormous stress," he testified, his voice carrying the same defensive tone that had characterized his interactions with police, lawyers, and counselors for months. "My company was about to go public. We had just lost major funding, and I was trying to provide financial security for my growing family. When Rebecca questioned my business judgment at such a critical time, it felt like she was undermining everything I was working toward." "So you threw a chair at her head?" the prosecutor asked during cross-examination. "I threw a chair toward the wall behind her because I was frustrated and needed a physical outlet for my emotions. It was never intended to harm her or put her in danger." "But you acknowledge that the chair came within inches of striking your pregnant wife?" "Yes, but that was because my aim was compromised by my emotional state, not because I intended to hurt her." Even under oath, Garrett couldn't admit that his behavior had been intentionally abusive. He continued to frame the incident as a regrettable accident rather than the culmination of years of escalating domestic violence. His complete lack of empathy for Rebecca's experience or genuine remorse for the trauma he had caused was evident to everyone in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: assault in the second degree, domestic violence, and endangering the welfare of an unborn child. The foreman read the verdicts with the kind of conviction that suggested the panel had found the case straightforward rather than difficult. Garrett Morrison was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation that included mandatory domestic violence counseling and a permanent restraining order, prohibiting him from contacting Rebecca or Hope without court approval. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Garrett looked back at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read, part anger, part confusion, part something that might have been the beginning of genuine recognition of what he had lost through his own actions. Rebecca felt no satisfaction in his conviction, no sense of victory or revenge. She felt only relief that her daughter would grow up in a world where domestic violence had consequences, where women's voices were believed, where no amount of money could buy silence about abuse. Walking out of the courthouse with hope in her arms and surrounded by advocates who had supported her throughout the legal process, Rebecca realized that her testimony had been about more than just holding one man accountable for his crimes. It had been about refusing to let fear, financial pressure, or social expectations silence her voice when she finally found the courage to use it. Some things she had learned really were more important than money, and courage, she discovered, was worth more than comfort. She named the baby Hope. 9 months after the trial that had ended with Garrett Morrison's conviction on multiple domestic violence charges, Rebecca held her 14-month-old daughter in the same hospital where she had once feared for both their lives. They were there for Hope's regular pediatric checkup, a routine appointment that represented everything normal and peaceful about the life they had built together. The irony of location wasn't lost on Rebecca. This was where she had finally found the courage to tell the truth about her marriage, where Dr. Holbrook had treated her injuries and helped her understand that leaving was possible, where she had first felt the safety that came from being surrounded by people whose job was to protect rather than control. Now she was back as a successful single mother, entrepreneur, and domestic violence advocate whose story had inspired thousands of women to recognize abuse and seek help. The delivery of Hope had been as peaceful as her conception had been traumatic. A natural birth attended by Sarah and Dr. Holbrook, surrounded by support and love rather than fear and violence. Garrett had been in prison during his daughter's birth, serving the first months of his 3-year sentence for domestic violence and assault charges. "She's hitting all her developmental milestones beautifully," Dr. Patricia Holbrook observed as she examined Hope, who was babbling happily and trying to grab everything within reach. Strong, healthy, curious about the world, she's clearly thriving in her environment. Rebecca smiled, watching her daughter's fearless exploration of the examination room. Hope approached everything, new toys, new people, new experiences, with confident curiosity rather than wariness. She had never learned to monitor adults' moods for signs of danger, never developed the hypervigilance that had defined Rebecca's own childhood and marriage. She gets that confidence from you, Sarah observed. Sarah had moved in with Rebecca during the final months of her pregnancy and stayed to help with childcare, while Rebecca rebuilt her career and established her advocacy work. Their relationship had evolved from sisters-in-law to chosen family, bonded by their shared commitment to breaking the cycle of abuse that had defined their family for generations. The transformation in Rebecca's life over the past 2 years had been remarkable by any measure. Using her background in marketing and her platform as a domestic violence survivor, she had built a consulting business focused on helping women-owned enterprises develop successful marketing strategies. Word had spread quickly through networks of female entrepreneurs, and within 18 months, she had more clients than she could handle. But her most meaningful work was speaking at domestic violence awareness events, sharing her story with audiences of women who recognized themselves in her experience. The wealthy, educated wife who had stayed with an abusive husband because she couldn't see the manipulation happening gradually around her, who had convinced herself that financial security was worth the cost of psychological safety. "I thought I was alone," she told a gathering of professional women at a downtown conference center, Hope sitting contentedly in her stroller beside the podium. "I thought I was the only educated, successful woman foolish enough to let a man isolate me from my friends, control my finances, and destroy my self-confidence. I was wrong. Coercive control and domestic abuse happen to doctors, lawyers, executives, teachers, journalists. Any woman can become a victim of systematic manipulation designed to strip away her independence and self-worth." The response to her speaking engagements was overwhelming. Women approached her after every presentation with their own stories of psychological abuse disguised as protective love, financial control framed as responsible partnership, isolation presented as romantic devotion. Many were still trapped in relationships they couldn't see clearly, grateful to hear someone articulate patterns they couldn't yet name. Rebecca began working with Detective Lisa Rodriguez to develop training programs for law enforcement officers on recognizing domestic abuse in affluent communities. Too many cases were dismissed or minimized because victims seemed to have everything: beautiful homes, expensive cars, apparent financial security, while their emotional prisons remained invisible to outsiders who only saw the material benefits of their marriages. "The chair missing my head wasn't lucky," Rebecca told one audience, her voice carrying the authority that came from lived experience. "It was necessary. Sometimes the mask has to come off completely before we can see what we've been living with, before we can find the courage to choose safety over security." Her story had become a case study in domestic violence advocacy circles, used to train counselors, legal professionals, and medical personnel on the specific challenges faced by educated, financially comfortable victims of abuse. The fact that she had turned down millions of dollars to testify against her abuser had particular resonance, challenging assumptions about why women stayed in abusive relationships and what it took to leave them. Garrett's company, TechFlow Solutions, had collapsed completely during his legal troubles, costing investors tens of millions and destroying the careers of several employees who bore no responsibility for his personal behavior. The ripple effects of domestic abuse, Rebecca had learned, extended far beyond the immediate victims to impact entire communities and industries. He had been released from prison after serving 22 months of his 3-year sentence, his time reduced for good behavior and completion of mandatory anger management in domestic violence counseling. Now he lived in a modest apartment across town, working as a freelance consultant for a fraction of his former salary and struggling to rebuild any semblance of the life he had destroyed. Their court-supervised visits were scheduled twice monthly for 2 hours each, always in the presence of a court-appointed guardian who monitored his interactions with Hope and ensured Rebecca's safety. The little girl showed no particular attachment to the father she saw infrequently, treating him more like a friendly stranger than a parent. "She's walking really well now," Garrett observed during one recent visit, watching Hope toddle around the supervised visitation center with determined concentration. She's obviously very smart. Gets that from both of us, I guess. She's also completely fearless, Rebecca replied, noting how Hope approached everything with confident curiosity. That's something new in our family history. Their conversations were limited and carefully monitored, focused entirely on Hope's development and needs. Too much damage had been done, too many trust boundaries violated, for them to ever have normal co-parenting discussions. But they could coexist peacefully for their daughter's sake, and Rebecca viewed that as progress rather than failure. The financial settlement from their divorce had been substantial, but not the millions Garrett had originally offered to buy her silence. Rebecca had used the money strategically, purchasing a modest but comfortable house in a safe neighborhood, establishing college funds for Hope, investing in her business, and contributing significantly to domestic violence prevention organizations. She had learned that financial independence was about more than just having money. It was about having the power to make choices based on your values rather than your fears. What do you want Hope to remember about this period in your lives? Dr. Walsh asked during one of their monthly therapy sessions, which Rebecca had continued as part of her ongoing recovery from trauma. Rebecca thought about the question while watching her daughter play with blocks in the corner of the therapist's office, building towers and knocking them down with delighted laughter. I want her to remember that her mother chose courage over comfort, Rebecca said finally. That when I was forced to choose between financial security and personal integrity, I chose integrity. I want her to grow up knowing that women don't have to accept abuse in exchange for any amount of money or security. And what do you want to remember about this journey? That the broken window wasn't destruction, it was revelation. It showed me what I had been hiding from, but more importantly, it showed me that I had the strength to choose something better. It taught me that my voice was worth more than my silence, that my daughter's future was worth more than my comfort. As they prepared to leave the therapy session, Hope toddled over to Rebecca and raised her arms to be picked up, a gesture so trusting and confident that it never failed to bring tears to Rebecca's eyes. This was what love looked like without fear, uncomplicated, generous, based on genuine care rather than control. Outside the therapist's office, the late spring sun cast everything in golden light as they walked to their car. Rebecca strapped Hope into her car seat and listened to her daughter's cheerful babbling as they drove home to the house they shared with Sarah, where 3 generations of women were working to create new patterns of strength and independence. The chair that had missed Rebecca's head 2 years earlier had shattered more than just a window. It had shattered the illusion that money could buy silence, that success justified abuse, that love required fear as its foundation. In its place, Rebecca had built something infinitely more valuable, a life where she and her daughter could both flourish freely, where truth mattered more than appearances, where courage was valued above comfort, where women's voices were believed and protected. She had named her daughter Hope for obvious reasons, as a symbol of the future she was determined to create, as a reminder that new beginnings were always possible, as proof that love could triumph over violence. But as Rebecca watched Hope grow into a confident, curious, fearless little girl who had never learned to walk on eggshells around anyone's mood, she realized that her daughter had given her something equally precious in return. Hope had given her back her own hope. Hope that she could rebuild her life on her own terms. Hope that her voice could make a difference for other women. Hope that the cycle of abuse could be broken through courage and determination. The broken window had become their doorway to freedom, and Rebecca Morrison had finally found her way home to herself. At the house that evening, as she tucked Hope into her crib and listened to her daughter's contented, sleepy sounds, Rebecca reflected on how completely their lives had changed. 2 years ago, she had been trapped in a marble prison, afraid to voice her own opinions, financially dependent on a man who used money as a weapon of control. Now she was an independent entrepreneur, a recognized advocate for domestic violence survivors, a mother raising her daughter to be fearless in a world that often tried to silence women's voices. She had built a career she was proud of, relationships based on mutual respect rather than power imbalances, and a life where her choices reflected her values rather than her fears. The journey hadn't been easy. Single motherhood was exhausting, especially while building a business and managing the ongoing legal complexities of co-parenting with a convicted domestic abuser. There had been moments of doubt, Nights when she wondered if she had made the right choice in turning down financial security for the uncertainty of independence. But watching Hope sleep peacefully in her own room, in a house where raised voices meant excitement rather than danger, Rebecca knew she had chosen correctly. Her daughter would grow up never knowing what it felt like to monitor someone else's emotions for her own safety. Hope would learn that love was patient and kind, not controlling and violent. She would understand that her voice mattered, that her opinions deserved respect, that she never had to choose between her safety and her security. Most importantly, Hope would know that her mother had chosen courage when it mattered most, that she had valued truth over comfort and integrity over money. The broken window that had once seemed like the destruction of everything Rebecca knew had become the opening through which she found everything she needed: her voice, her strength, her purpose, and her freedom. As she turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Rebecca whispered a final promise to her sleeping daughter and to herself. "We will never again mistake control for love. We will never accept fear as the price of security. And we will always remember that some things, courage, truth, dignity, hope, are worth more than all the money in the world." The chair had missed her head by inches, but it had hit its real target perfectly: the cage of silence and fear that had trapped her for so long. Now finally free, Rebecca Morrison and her daughter Hope were ready to build a future where love meant safety, where success meant authenticity, and where the most valuable currency wasn't money. It was the courage to live according to your own values, no matter the cost. The broken window had become their doorway to a life where neither of them would ever again have to choose between love and fear. And that, Rebecca knew, was worth everything. Rebecca Morrison chose courage when it cost her everything, and in doing so, she found everything she truly needed. Her story proves that our voices are more powerful than we know, and our choices can break cycles that have trapped generations. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to something you hadn't seen before, or if it reminded you that courage is always possible, even in the darkest moments, show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps stories like Rebecca's reach other women who might need to hear them. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Rebecca's situation? Have you ever had to choose between safety and security? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Rebecca's message. You never know whose life might be changed by understanding that they're not alone, that leaving is possible, and that their voice has power. And if you want to hear more true stories of courage, transformation, and triumph over impossible odds, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Every week we share real stories about real people who chose to rewrite their lives when the world told them it was impossible. Remember, you are stronger than you know. Your voice matters more than you think, and it's never too late to choose courage over comfort. Thank you for listening to Rebecca's story, and I'll see you in the next one.